The small chamber echoed with the screams of the unfortunate soul as thongs were secured around his wrists and ankles preparatory to sentence being carried out. He had been slower and therefore unluckier than his partners in crime. While they had managed to outrun the guards, he had been less successful in departing the tomb they had thought to despoil. Not only was his death sentence automatic, but the fact that he had dared to brave the chamber leading to the greatest secrets of the pharaohs guaranteed that his execution would be singularly unpleasant. Having completed tethering the miscreant in place, the executioner reached for the large, sharpened iron stake that had been lying in the embers of a small fire. Slowly and carefully, he began to insert it into the tomb robber's nether regions. The screams were interrupted by a sharp, harsh shriek. Then they began again, rising in intensity, as the condemned man was slowly impaled by the heated metal. When only a foot or two of the stake remained, the criminal was turned so he could see that the fire had been stoked with additional rushes. Comprehension rushed into his expression as the executioner picked one up and wedged it against his skin, which almost immediately began to singe, then to smolder from the direct contact of the flame. Now the grave robber's pleas to the gods for mercy became more frantic. If he were burned to ashes, there would be no body to pass into the afterlife, and his impalement would prevent his ba from ever leaving this place. Stolidly, the executioner continued placing flaming rushes around and on the dying man's body, then stood unmoving as the screams continued, finally dissipating into a last sigh of despair as the flames consumed it. Imhotep, the architect of the tomb and sanctuary, shook his head in disgust. The events of the last few days had taken their toll on him, and he was now totally and utterly exhausted. He walked slowly down from the sanctuary exit by the cliff face and looked back up to the hole that marked the sun window into the sanctuary. No one could tell from here that there was a way into the chamber. The climb up the rock face to the entrance was too steep anyway. Once the descent ropes had been removed, no one would have any idea that a hidden chamber existed here. The priest's way into the sanctuary was safe. Now that the portal gate in the Sun Temple had been hidden, the underground tunnel system would be equally difficult to find. Anyone who attempted that route would in any case have to negotiate the 12 hours of the night and the many perils of the underworld. Only the high priests of the Temple of Osiris had the knowledge that was needed to navigate the chambers. It was unlikely that anyone not privy to those mysteries could get through successfully. Tomb robbers did not know of the Amduat, nor did they understand its purpose. Imhotep breathed a sigh of relief. Turning towards the midday sun, he felt its warmth upon his face and remembered a short verse from the sacred texts. Praise to thee that rises up and lights the two lands. Thou godly beloved youth, when you arise, men live. Give me eternal light that I may see thy beauty. We are nothing without you. The tomb of destiny was now secure and hidden for all time, or so he thought. Charlie Waterman shifted uncomfortably on the worn seat of the railway carriage as the train steamed its way across the old brick viaduct towards Wilton Village. Only 5 minutes to Wilton Station, he thought, as the train whistled through the long, dark tube that was the Brampton Tunnel and emerged like a cannonball into the afternoon sunshine. Some years ago, Charlie would have contemplated this journey with undisguised eagerness, but now he found himself anticipating his return to the family home with a certain degree of disquiet. Reaching into his jacket pocket, he withdrew the mysterious summons that had arrived 2 weeks previously and read it through once again, but he was still greatly confused. The house and grounds of the Wilton estate had been owned by Charlie's family since Tudor times, but the estate had been purchased by a local industrialist 10 years ago when Charlie's grandfather had died. The new owner, Mister Edward Sampson, an enigmatic character, had written to Charlie asking him to revisit his childhood home. The letter itself, gave no indication as to what reasons Sampson might have for the invitation, and Charlie was still unsure why he had accepted it. But one thing was for sure. Charlie was glad to be away from his dull job at his father's law practice. He jumped at the chance to get away from the smoke of London and back to the countryside of his youth. Charlie's memories of Wilton Hall revolved mostly around his late grandfather, Charles Waterman Sr., who had provided him with all the nurturing and affection that any young boy might have craved. The squire was a renowned naturalist who had traveled extensively around the world, and he had created a wildlife sanctuary on the estate, which had been a continuing source of wonder and enjoyment to Charlie during his formative years. Charlie's thoughts wandered for a moment as he remembered his grandfather's exploits. He often dreamed of being in the jungles of Guyana, just like his grandfather, discovering some lost Mayan treasure, or an uncharted river, or some new species of animal. Charlie longed for an adventure of his own, but deep down inside, he knew that he was stuck in a rut. His father ruled his life totally. Charlie worked in a dull London office, and he knew that there wasn't much hope of things changing anytime soon. But maybe this letter from Sampson might be the start of something exciting, something new. Charlie hoped with all his heart that it might be. Charlie's thoughts jerked back to the present as the steam train heaved itself to a hissing stop at Wilton Village Station. Charlie stepped out of the carriage into the afternoon sunshine. Carpetbag under his arm, he ventured cautiously along the long platform and headed for the station booking office. The letter had indicated that he would be met, but the few loiterers on the platform itself took no interest in the 24-year-old blonde-haired young man wearing city clothes. Once inside the booking office, however, it was a different story, as Charlie found his hand seized and pumped by an elderly gentleman in uniform, sporting a magnificent fob watch and huge handlebar mustache. "Charlie Waterman, as I live and breathe, it's been a long time." Charlie grinned as he recognized the other man. "Mr. Dartington, I can't believe you're still working here, and a station master now, I see." He shook the other man's hand, delighted to see a familiar face. "Come into my office and sit for a cup," Dartington suggested. "You've time to tell me what you've done since you've grown up." He winked at Charlie's questioning look. "They told me to expect you today. Mr. Sampson is even sending down his fancy new car to collect you." "Fancy new car?" Charlie thought with interest. He nodded and gratefully accepted a cup of tea and a digestive biscuit while he caught up on old times. He had just finished his third biscuit and listened to the station master's second anecdote when he heard a loud noise outside sounding very much like an affronted goose. Curiously, he rose and walked across to the door, just in time to see an extremely elegant motor car roll regally to a stop in front of the station, its klaxon-style horn bleating periodically to announce its arrival. It certainly looked like Edward Sampson had plenty of style. A brawny, sandy-haired man in chauffeur's livery stepped down from the automobile and approached, limping slightly. As he drew closer, he removed large driving goggles to reveal suspicious gray eyes. "Mr. Waterman?" the man growled, staring directly at Charlie. "Yes, that's me." Charlie decided not to invite this somewhat hostile-looking individual to call him by his first name. "I assume you're here to take me to Wilton Hall?" The eyes gazed at him levelly for a moment, and then the chauffeur nodded in affirmation. He then turned silently to collect Charlie's bag from Dartington, who had brought it out from the station booking office. Then he turned back to Charlie and said gruffly, "Let's go then." There was a short pause while the two men stared at each other. Then the chauffeur added, with just enough of a delay to stop short of insult, "Sir." He hefted the bag into the car and opened one door, waiting woodenly. Charlie wondered why this fellow, who he had only just met, was treating him with such contempt. He almost said something, but thought the better of it and turned to take his farewell of Dartington. I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to talk again, Mr. Dartington." They shook hands once more, and the young man stepped into the waiting motor car, which, with a loud honking of the horn, started up and swept out of the square. Once underway, Charlie's attempts to engage the driver in any kind of meaningful conversation were met for the most part with stony silence. After a growled "Max" in response to Charlie's hesitant inquiry as to his name, the chauffeur had concentrated, or pretended to concentrate, deeply on his driving, though there was little along the narrow country lane to cause him much concern. Any animals that might have been browsing for food along the shoulder of the road had dived for cover long before the car's arrival, alerted to its advent by the noise, and there was no other human traffic, foot or otherwise, on this drowsy summer afternoon. It wasn't long before the Palladian facade of Wilton Hall rose before them as they motored briskly up the graveled and crinkly driveway. It looked much brighter than Charlie's last memory. Then he realized the house must have undergone some refurbishment in that time. The sandy stone gleamed in the early afternoon sunlight, and the glass panes of the windows glistened. Charlie felt a rush of excitement. He was home again. The car slid smoothly to a stop, Max disembarking with the same awkwardness as before. Charlie pushed the front seat forward himself prior to getting out, without waiting for the chauffeur to help him. The only response was a flash of something in Max's eyes. Resentment? He wasn't sure. But then Max turned away and busied himself with removing Charlie's bag. Charlie didn't wait for him. Instead, he stepped forward, crossed the iron footbridge leading to the hall, and gazed up at the wide front door and the motto carved above it. He grinned to himself as he remembered the first time that his grandfather had pointed it out to him. Better kinda frenda than strange kine. The squire had read it aloud, elongating the vowels slightly. Then he had put his hand on the small boy's shoulder and smiled broadly. Loosely, it means, "Don't trust your relatives." Charlie had gazed up at the stone words, and then turned a puzzled look on his grandfather. "But that means I shouldn't trust you, grandfather." His grandfather had laughed, and then sobered abruptly. He dropped to one knee and put his arm around Charlie's shoulders. "We'll make a pact then, boy. I'll promise never to tell you untruths, and you'll do the same for me." He hugged his grandson close to him. "Always tell the truth, and seek the truth, Charlie, and you'll go far in this world." Well, the older Charlie admitted to himself, he had never lied to anybody, but he was still waiting for the piece of serendipity that would start him on his journey to greatness, or even some career more significant than pushing paper around in his father's law offices. The old mahogany doors of the mansion swung open with a creak, and an elderly figure in house dress and apron rushed out, beaming. "Charlie Waterman, all grown up. Let me look at you, young man." Charlie grinned and returned the housekeeper's embrace, slightly disconcerted at how small she seemed, until he remembered she would have seemed much larger to a small boy, and of course she had to be fairly elderly by now. But the brown eyes were undimmed by age, the brown hair full and exuberant, swept up into a massive bun which threatened to unbalance the wearer, and her grip was strong. She had essentially been a mother figure to Charlie, baking him biscuits and cakes one day, and then the next day threatening discipline on the end of a paddle, as punishment for some boyish prank gone awry, comforting him when the bewilderment caused by his parents' divorce threatened to unman him, and he adored her. "Mrs. Andrews, you certainly haven't aged a day. You look wonderful," he exclaimed mischievously, picking her up and swirling her around before setting her back down, retreating hastily as she made to swat at him. "Get on with you," she replied, her hands performing a miracle of engineering on the teetering hair, which subsided back into its less precarious state, but her smile showed that she was pleased. "Max, please put Master Charlie's bag in the attic room. Charlie, I've a snack waiting for you. Come into the kitchen and I'll pour." Charlie reached out and snagged his bag from the chauffeur, whose expressive eyes revealed resentment at the housekeeper's affection for Charlie. "Never mind, Max. It's only a small bag. I'm perfectly capable of taking it upstairs myself." Once in the kitchen, Charlie sank into an overstuffed sofa and happily accepted the loaded plate and steaming cup that Mrs. Andrews handed to him. Her sandwiches were just as good as he remembered, and he told her so, enjoying the flush which flitted over her face. "So, what has happened since I left?" Charlie asked. Looking up from her own cup, she replied, "Oh, sir, there have been so many changes, although I must admit that the new master has had the good sense to avoid anything which would have ruined the hall's flavor. He bought all of your grandfather's personal things, his books, his collection of stuffed animals, various artifacts, and all of the carpets and furniture. It's said that he paid a pretty price for the lot, and that he outbid everyone else by a large margin. He must have been very keen to have it all, that's all I can say. But I have to admit that he's shown the hall some respect, and it certainly has been nice having modern conveniences. The electric lights are a marvel." He had to agree with her there. He remembered all too well the darkened corners left unlit by the old gas lamps, full of mysterious shadows which too easily became monsters in a small boy's keen imagination. Although in a way it was a pity that future generations of children might not have the chance to be similarly thrilled. He'd never needed many toys. The house itself was his playground, and its varied contents more than enough to stimulate his interests. She was looking a little sad, presumably musing over the good old days, so he changed the subject. "So, what about the newer staff? What are they like?" She shrugged. "Oh, they're pleasant enough." She broke off at his surprised look and then started to laugh. "I suppose you've noticed, Max." "Well, yes. I was trying to fit him into your description of pleasant." The housekeeper shook her head. "It's sad about that one. Promise me you'll never go to the fighting, Mr. Charlie." He smiled at her apparent resolution of her dilemma as to how to address him properly. "Don't worry, Mrs. Andrews, I have no desire to kill anyone." "So it's a war wound, then? His limp, I mean." She nodded. "Not that you heard me tell it to you. He'd go into a proper rage if he knew. And he used to be such a cheerful lad." She poured them both another cup, and then settled back in her chair. "He's from over by Wakefield. Went to school with my sister's lad, Robert. They both enlisted in the army, and Max was doing quite well for himself. Promoted up to sergeant. Special forces, I think. Then they were sent over to Africa to fight the Boers, and Max returned home permanently lamed." Her delivery was oddly compelling. "And Robert?" Charlie asked curiously. "What happened to Robert?" Mrs. Andrews shook her head, looking slightly down towards the floor. "He didn't come home at all," she replied quietly. "That's when the change really started with Max. He'd been back just 2 weeks, furious at being invalided out. Then the news came about Robert, and Max went a little wild. They finally sent him to a sanitarium to recover." Charlie suppressed a shiver. That was not a fate he would have wanted for himself. "But he's recovered now, hasn't he?" he ventured. "As much as could be supposed," the old woman remarked. "He went off to find work, and that was the last I saw of him before he showed up here driving Mr. Sampson's new car and helping out around the house. But he's not the same Max that I knew as a boy. There's a temper there now and something else eating at him, I'm sure of it." She reached out and patted his hand. "Now you, on the other hand, I dare say are still the same jackanapes you were as a child." "Absolutely. You wouldn't have me any other way." Charlie grinned, ducking as she made to swat his ear. "And you definitely haven't changed." They finished their tea, Charlie growing quiet as he continued to gaze around the room, remembering his grandfather's long fingers pointing out some interesting detail on this or that item as he showed it to the fascinated boy. Mrs. Andrews noticed his abstraction. "What is it, Mr. Charlie?" "Oh, just thinking about grandfather, and wondering why Sampson's called me here." The eager look in her eyes dimmed momentarily, and she shrugged. "I truly don't know, Charlie. Just the other day he comes to me and asks me to make up your room. Says he's asked you to come and see him." She drained her tea with an air of finality. "He's at his factory now, but he'll be home for dinner. I suppose he'll tell you then. He can be quite mysterious at times." She stood up and smoothed her skirt. "Why don't I take you upstairs? I made up your grandfather's attic room for you. I thought you might like that. Dinner won't be until 8. Mr. Sampson tends to get home late." Touched by her kindness, he rose and gave her a hug. "Thanks, Mrs. Andrews. I would like that very much. That was very thoughtful of you." As they ascended the wide stairs, Max watched them both from the bottom of the stairs without saying a word. Mrs. Andrews pushed open the bedroom door and stepped inside, checking here and there to make sure all was at rights. Charlie swung his bag onto the valet near the door and began wandering himself. He had only been in his grandfather's bedroom a handful of times. It held a few prized portions of his famous stuffed animal collection that he had preferred not to share with the public. Happy that everything was in order, Mrs. Andrews hurried off downstairs and, left to himself, Charlie continued his roaming around the room, picking up this curio or that. On the wall over the bed was a portrait of his grandfather, resplendent in his Sunday best and sporting a very short haircut. He stopped to admire a small mother-of-pearl inlaid clock, and he realized that he might have time to take a stroll around the grounds before dinner. "I'll go and see my grandfather," he thought to himself, and promptly made his way outdoors. The hall itself stood on what was essentially an island, in the middle of a small man-made lake, accessible by way of an iron footbridge. It had been built on the foundations of an Elizabethan mansion, of which only the water gate still survived. To the east stretched the nature reserve created and walled off by Charles Waterman when he returned from his various trips of exploration. He had populated it with over 100 species of birds during his remaining lifetime, and as a boy, Charlie had walked there every day with his grandfather, listening raptly as the old man pointed out rare varieties that he had brought from South America, admiring the colorful flashes of plumage in the trees. Charlie loved the animals on the estate and had always been amazed at the care and attention that his grandfather had lavished upon them. "Life is precious, Charlie, human or otherwise. Always remember that," his grandfather had always told him, as they made their daily adventures around the grounds, and Charlie had never forgotten it. As he crossed the iron footbridge and wandered across the main lawn away from the house, Charlie noticed that the grounds did not seem to be as well maintained as he remembered, and he felt a flash of resentment at Sampson, at the interim tenants, and even at his father. Sampson and the tenants for neglecting the reserve, and his father for not caring enough to try to keep the hall in the family. His father had never liked living in the country and had escaped to city life eagerly. He had refused to spend the amounts of money necessary to keep the property. Charlie had objected, of course, and continued to fuss. When he failed to respond to more diplomatic attempts at communication, his father had finally growled, "When and if you can raise the wherewithal to purchase the property yourself, you have my blessing. But I will not be an investor," and sent him back to school. Remembering that argument now, Charlie still disapproved of his father's opinion, but he was in no position to change the situation. He saw a flash of white on the lake, followed by a heron taking off into the air, and smiled, wondering if his grandfather's ghost was out roaming the grounds. The old man had especially admired the herons, and it had been whispered locally that he continued to haunt the nature reserve as one of his beloved birds. Charlie remembered his grandfather's funeral, which had been very grand indeed. It had been conducted by the local bishop and attended by thousands of local businessmen and dignitaries, not to mention the entire village of Wilton and most of Wakefield. His grandfather had been well liked in the area. The funeral had been a very solemn and majestic affair, starting with the service at the Catholic church in Wilton Village. His grandfather, like generations of prior Watermans, had been a devout Catholic. Following the Mass, the procession, led by the horse-drawn cortege, had wound its way towards Wilton Hall, where a magnificent funeral barge waited by the bridge. Like a latter-day pharaoh, Charles Waterman had been floated across the water to his eternal resting place on the opposite side of the lake. At the end of the burial ceremony, a heron had startled up from the reeds nearby to fly away in a white blur. It hadn't taken much imagination for the legend to start after that. As if his feet had been following his train of thought, Charlie looked up to discover that he had subconsciously made his way around the lake to his grandfather's grave. It was presided over by a simple cross, carved with a Celtic knotwork design, which had already acquired a partial coat of moss on the crossbar arms. Today, however, and rather spookily, it was also adorned by a large white heron sitting on the top, which stared calmly at the startled young man for a moment, before it casually opened its wings and flew away. Slightly unnerved, Charlie reached out and began brushing off what moss he could, fingering the lettering on the stone, reading the words aloud. Orate pro anima, Caroli Waterman, cujus fessa, juxta hanc crucem sepeliunter ossa natus. Pray for the soul of Charles Waterman, whose wearied bones lie close to this cross. The pain of losing his grandfather rushed back, as if the intervening years had never taken place, and Charlie sank down into a crouch and mourned his grandfather's passing yet again. After a few pensive minutes, his thoughts began to take shape in speech, and he found himself talking out loud to his absent grandfather. You always listened to me when I was a small boy, grandfather, not like my father. He wasn't interested in me at all, and he was never home. You were my real father. I miss you, grandfather. He continued in this vein for a few more minutes, getting noticeably upset, then dragged his sleeve across his eyes and took a deep breath. The spot his grandfather had chosen was innately peaceful, and even in his sorrow, he was happy to be there, instead of behind a desk in his father's office. He reached out and yanked up a weed which had the temerity to try to grow at the foot of the stone, then continued tidying up the area. Task completed, he rose and scavenged some wildflowers to put in the pot before heading off to wander the grounds some more. Mr. Charlie? Charlie glanced up, startled, to find an elderly gardener staring at him with surprise and pleasure. Desmond? My goodness, I didn't expect to find you still working here. Why haven't you retired to a nice cozy chair and mug of tea like you deserve? A huge grin split his cheeks that were tanned almost to walnut. Short, wiry, dark-haired, and dark-eyed, the old man had been tending the nature reserve for years. Sometimes it seemed as if he himself were one of its denizens rather than its caretaker. The old man smiled. Ah, lad, you know I've always been happiest with my plants. Why would I want to spend all my time inside? What brings you back to the hall? Charlie laughed and related the story of Sampson's letter. Do you have any idea why he wants to see me? Desmond shrugged. Not a clue. He never tells me anything. I wish he'd pay a little more attention to the reserve, though. It's getting harder and harder to take care of it properly. There's just myself now. And it's a large park, you know. Your grandfather really loved it. He leaned against his rake. Your grandfather was a great man, Charlie, full of adventure and humor. There was that time in Guyana that he wrestled with a caiman. A gigantic man-eating monster crocodile it was. What happened? Charlie asked, intrigued. Well, Desmond continued, he told me they were on the Essequibo River there, and had caught the beast with a baited hook that they'd tied onto a rope. But your grandfather wanted to take it alive. So instead of shooting it, he had 7 men stand on dry land and hold the rope while he goes out into the river in a canoe, which the caiman probably could have destroyed in one bite, mind you. And there he paddles up to the caiman and just jumps out onto its back and wrestles it to shore. He shook his head in admiration. Amazing man, the squire. A little eccentric at times, but amazing nonetheless. Yes, he was, Charlie replied quietly. They both stood for a few minutes in silence, reliving their own personal memories, and then Desmond shouldered his rake. Well, I must be off. It's nice to see you again, lad. Charlie nodded. Same here, Desmond. I'll make sure to stop and see you again before I leave. He started back towards the house, and then diverted his footsteps to the path leading to the great oak tree which his grandfather had climbed every morning at dawn. In fact, the last time the squire climbed, it was the day he died. Somehow he slipped out of the tree and fell. One of the junior gardeners found him and ran for help, but the old man died later that day, without ever regaining consciousness. Charlie swung himself up easily into the tree and onto the firm, knotted branch, which had been his grandfather's favorite, its bark worn away as a result of years of use. He shuddered to think that his grandfather had been sat on this very branch the day he had slipped and fallen to his death. He looked down to the ground about 30 feet below him and took a tighter hold on the branch, wrapping his legs tightly underneath to be sure. From this vantage point, he could see a large part of the estate: the house, the lake, his grandfather's grave, and the high wall built to protect the boundaries of the reserve. The early evening sun was now casting long shadows across the manicured lawns, highlighting the textures and topology of the land. Curiously, over to the south side of the hall, Charlie could see something odd projecting into the sky. It looked like a stone obelisk of sorts, but he couldn't be sure what it was. He thought for a moment, trying to remember, but he didn't recall there being anything with odd, pointy bits near the house when he was a child. Whatever it was, it stuck out like a sore thumb. Charlie glanced at his watch. 7:30 p.m., more than enough time before dinner. He slid down the tree and went across to investigate. Charlie stared up at the strange, multi-sided globe of Yorkshire stone, which rested on a stone plinth near the south facade of the hall. He had never seen anything quite as strange as this in all his life. The whole structure stood some 7 or 8 feet tall. He began counting the triangular faces of the polygon, stopping when he reached 20, all of them equal, forming an icosahedron, one of the 5 perfect solids of Plato. On the face of each equilateral triangle, a metal rod was set upright at a funny angle to cast a shadow, and each face was carved with lines indicating the hours of the day. Charlie quickly realized that the strange object was in fact a very complicated multi-faced sundial. Closer examination of the device revealed that the names of cities from all over the world were engraved on each of the dial faces in order of longitude. Charlie realized that one could determine the solar time in each of the cities recorded on the different dials simultaneously. Since the icosahedron rested precariously on one of its corners without seeming to wobble or lean to one side, he figured that a strong iron rod must travel through the stone head of the sundial and into the base to support it. Fascinated, he continued his inspection, noticing that the dials were showing the time in an interesting combination of cities: London, New York, Cadiz, Algeciras, Malaga, and Georgetown. Perhaps these were chosen because his grandfather had visited them. On one of the faces, an inscription claimed G. Bowlby Fecit, meaning it had been made by G. Bowlby. On a whim, he pulled out his pocket watch and compared it to the dial marked London. Since the sun was still shining quite brightly, the style showed a clear line on the dial. However, he was disappointed to note that the dial's accuracy was questionable, as his watch proved the dial to be almost 6 minutes slow. Perhaps, he mused, that's why we don't use sundials anymore. He was so engrossed in the remarkable sculpture that he failed to hear footsteps approaching from behind him, and he jumped, startled at the sound of a voice. "Hello there, young man. I thought I might find you out here." Charlie came back to earth and whirled to see a slender, well-dressed man holding out one hand, a walking stick in the other. Thick gray hair waved back from a long, narrow face, wearing a pleasantly innocuous expression. "I'm Edward Sampson, and you must be Charlie Waterman. I'm glad to meet you, very glad." The newcomer glanced toward the structure and laughed. "You are just like your grandfather, Charlie. He was absolutely fascinated by sundials and scientific things. He acquired this magnificent specimen some years ago." Charlie shook his head. We have a horizontal sundial in the garden at my father's house, but I've never seen anything quite like this one. Sampson started wandering around the base, occasionally fingering one of the sides. It is one of the most complicated types of dials that it is possible to make. It was made by a local stonemason, George Bowlby, to your grandfather's specifications. But your grandfather marked out the lines himself. Simple horizontal and vertical dials are hard enough to construct, but it takes spherical trigonometry, not to mention a great quantity of brain work, to construct these complicated polyhedral dials. I didn't realize that they were so difficult to make, remarked Charlie. Sampson gave the sundial an admiring look. Yes, they are. Once upon a time, these types of dial were the reserve of kings, but your grandfather did it, Charlie. He figured it all out and made one for himself. Well, Charlie said slowly, hoping he wasn't being rude, then it's a shame that it doesn't tell the time very well. Sampson laughed. That's because you need to correct it, Charlie. Let me explain. When you compare sun time with an accurate watch, there can be a difference, depending on the time of year. Charlie gave him a puzzled look. What do you mean a difference? Well, Sampson replied, a watch ticks away at a steady, regular pace all year round, but unfortunately, the Earth's movement around the sun is not so regular. Because of its elliptical orbit, it speeds up and slows down. That variation throughout the year causes differences between sun time and clock time. However, he continued, holding up a hand to forestall the logical objection, it's easy to correct the difference. Scientists have worked out the differences in minutes for each day of the year, and they call the differences the equation of time, or EOT. This time of the year, the sun is about 6 minutes slow when compared to a watch. Charlie checked the time on the sundial again, adding 6 minutes to allow for EOT. What do you know? He exclaimed. It's spot on. That's amazing, Mr. Sampson. I never realized sundials told accurate time. Oh yes, Charlie, Sampson replied. But don't forget, in ancient times no one had a watch, so EOT didn't matter. In those days, the time by the sun was the time that everybody used, and rightly so too. He pointed a surprisingly large and thick finger towards the sun. If you think about it, Charlie, the sun is the natural timekeeper of the earth. It's only man in his infinite wisdom that chooses to measure time in a regulated way using a clock. Charlie shook his head in amazement. I've never thought about it like that before. Sampson nodded. The sun is a lot more important to us all than we give it credit for, Charlie. Life wouldn't have started on the earth had it not been for the sun. In fact, Charlie, he added solemnly, if the sun decided not to come up one morning, we'd all be in a terrible mess. Their brief conversation had broken the ice. Charlie could see that Mr. Sampson was not quite the ogre that he had been expecting. Anyway, that's enough of the boring scientific stuff. Come inside, Charlie, I have something for you. It's a letter from your grandfather. It was written just 2 days before he died. Charlie followed Sampson into the house, his thoughts whirling. A letter from his grandfather written just 2 days before he died? What could its contents possibly be? His reverie was disturbed by the sound of the dinner gong, followed by Sampson's voice. Ah, I see dinner is ready. Let's get something to eat, Charlie. I'm famished. After his rather substantial afternoon snack and the amazing discoveries of the day, Charlie wasn't sure that he would be hungry at all, until he saw the lovely meal that Mrs. Andrews had prepared for them waiting in the dining room. Max, now resplendent in butler's attire, served up the food. The smell of roast beef and Yorkshire pudding filled the air. The dining room itself was very inviting despite its size, with deep oak furnishings and warm-toned curtains, and he found himself sitting down at the table with more of an appetite than he would have thought possible. Charlie was dying to find out more about the letter, but Sampson insisted on chatting about various innocuous topics until he suddenly gave the younger man a curious look and asked bluntly, "So how did you come to live with your grandfather, if you don't mind my asking?" Charlie shrugged. I don't mind telling you, Mr. Sampson. I came to live here when I was 3 years old. My father brought me to stay with grandfather when my parents were divorcing. My father was busy building his law firm in London, and he didn't want me around. Sampson shook his head. That's too bad, Charlie. I'm sorry to hear that. So then I went to boarding school in Lancashire and moved back to my dad's home just before my grandfather died. He paused to let Max remove his plate and continued, secretly relieved that the butler had left the room for the moment. I was quite bright at school, but I guess I'm not really the academic type. My dad wanted me to go to university, but I flunked my entrance exams, so he bailed me out by giving me a job as a clerk at his law firm. He sighed. It's all terribly dull, I'm afraid. After all, pushing around bits of paper all day is not very exciting, is it? That's most often when I think about my grandfather and his exciting life traveling the world. Sampson gave him a sympathetic look, but quickly changed the subject. Have you got a girlfriend, Charlie? Yes, Charlie responded, perking up a little. She's called Victoria. I met her at a garden party 3 years ago, and we're getting engaged next week. She is very rich. Her father is a banker. Are you marrying her for her money? Sampson asked unexpectedly. Not really, said Charlie, quite taken aback at his blunt question. It's Victoria that I love, not her money. Beg pardon, just asking, said Sampson, noticeably embarrassed. My turn to interrogate, Charlie decided. So what do you do for a living, Mr. Sampson? Oh, I have a few factories. I wouldn't say I was a rich man, but I don't do too badly. Charlie looked surprised. It was his understanding that the Sampson family was very wealthy. The car alone must have cost him a small fortune. Sampson was just being modest. Sampson's smile faded a little, and his eyes flickered toward a portrait hanging on the wall. My father was the one who established the factories, Charlie, but he is no longer with us. I was just lucky enough to inherit them. We manufacture soap. Charlie noticed the slight pause, but decided not to inquire into it. Instead, he asked slowly, Do you mind if I ask why you bought the hall? Sampson leaned back in his chair and looked slowly around the room. I used to walk past this place when I was a small boy. I always admired it. When it came up for sale, I thought it would be a good idea to buy it. I always wanted a stately home of my own. He gestured toward the portrait. My father didn't live to see me own it, Charlie, but he would have been proud. He took a sip of his wine and nodded reflectively. Yes, he would have been very proud. So you loved your father a great deal? Charlie asked, being equally blunt. Oh, yes, Sampson replied, his hand clenching on the stem of his glass, his eyes staring momentarily into space. Oh, yes, I loved him very much, very much. Charlie was taken aback at the blaze of emotion on the once pleasant face. He had obviously touched a nerve. Sampson's fingers relaxed their hold on the glass, but Charlie felt an inexplicable tickle on the back of his neck. Whatever shadow had slid over his host passed quickly, and Sampson began to talk of other things, including his new car, which he understood from Max had impressed Charlie a great deal. They were still discussing the merits and racing capabilities of the Panhard Levasseur when Max came in to clear away the final plates, giving his employer a telling look as he did so. Sampson pushed his chair back and rose. Would you care to join me in the library, Charlie? I have some excellent brandy. Charlie assented, still itching to find out more about the letter, and they strolled off to the library, where Sampson poured the drinks and turned to offer Charlie a cigar. Charlie smiled and shook his head. No thanks, Mr. Sampson, just the brandy is fine. He settled into one of the upholstered chairs and looked around as he drank. Ceiling-high shelves, crowded with volumes, and the occasional artifact ringed the room. In front of the window stood an immense desk. In his mind's eye, he could see his grandfather at the desk, writing in one of his innumerable journals, and he blinked, half expecting to see the old man there. Sampson walked over to the desk and picked up a white-sealed envelope. Returning to his chair, he busied himself with readying his cigar, talking between puffs. He then paused slightly for maximum effect and started to speak. "We were installing the electric lights recently in the upstairs rooms, and we found a hidden panel in your grandfather's attic bedroom. It contained this envelope, Charlie, dated 2 days before he died and addressed to you. I can only think that he put it there intending to give it to you later, but for whatever reason, he never did. Given the circumstances of his sudden death, I can understand why. I haven't opened it, Charlie. It's all sealed up anyway." Charlie took hold of the envelope wonderingly. After all these years, what could this mean? Sampson rose and stood in front of the fireplace, cigar in one hand, glass of brandy in the other. "I believe your grandfather is talking to you from the grave, Charlie." Charlie wasn't sure how he felt about this revelation, nor was he keen to speculate with the new owner of the hall about it. A message from the grave was the last thing that Charlie had expected when he had set out to visit the estate. After passing it over to him, Sampson had showed no further interest in the letter. Instead, he whittered on about various unimportant subjects, becoming slowly inebriated as he repeatedly topped up his brandy glass from a huge glass decanter. Finally, pleading exhaustion, Charlie succeeded in making his excuses and fled to his bedroom, unaware of the measuring, almost calculating expression on Sampson's face as he said goodnight. When he reached the attic bedroom, he sat down on the large bed and examined the envelope in great detail, turning it over and over in his hands. It was sealed with a glob of red wax bearing the family seal. It certainly looked to him as if this envelope had not been opened before. Carefully, he took his pocket knife and slit the letter open, a chill rippling through him as he read what may very well have been his grandfather's last words. "Dear Charlie, by the time you read this, Charlie, I will probably be dead. I am an old man, and my time will come soon. Don't worry about me, though. When I die, I will be in the hands of the Lord and at peace forever. I need you to finish off something that I was unable to do in my lifetime. I want you to solve a mystery, Charlie, a mystery that every generation of the Waterman family has failed to solve. You may know that we are descended from that great and illustrious fellow, Sir Thomas More, Chancellor of England and advisor to King Henry VIII. Well, he came into the possession of a certain notebook in 1522. The book contained a great secret, Charlie. Sir Thomas tried to solve the secret, but, alas, the solution eluded him, although he spent many years on the task. He gave the notebook to his son, who also tried, but failed. He in turn gave it to his son, and so on. The book passed down through the More family for almost 400 years. In 1767, your great-grandfather married Josephine More, and the notebook came over to our family. I was given it by my father just before he died. No one has been able to solve the puzzle that it contains. The notebook contains the location of a great treasure, Charlie, the greatest treasure the world has ever known. If you can solve the riddles that the book contains, you can find the treasure. I want you to give it a go. Search for the truth, Charlie, like I taught you when you were small. There is a lot more information in the notebook itself, but I have hidden it away so that it does not fall into the wrong hands. I know that somebody as resourceful as you will be able to find it. Solve the attached riddle to get started, and good luck. Your loving grandfather." There was a small folded piece of paper attached to the letter. When Charlie opened it, he found a riddle. The Romans are confused, but once set straight, the initial characters will reveal the place. Then use the locations of Cleopatra's needles and bring together time to reveal what you seek. Beneath those lines, he could see what looked on first glance like gibberish. Charlie stared at the paper in consternation. What was all this about? What was his grandfather trying to tell him? He felt as confused as the Romans in the verse, and then his brain made the connection. It referred to the letters. They were confused, they were backwards. His excitement growing, he scrabbled on the small secretary desk for a pen and paper, and then he began to work out the puzzle. After a few minutes, he had written each line in reverse order, which he hoped was what the verse meant by straight. When he inserted spaces to form Latin words, he saw the following. His memory of his Latin classes was certainly receiving some exercise. Charlie pondered the text for a while, racking his brain, but eventually he was able to arrive at a translation. Which meant just what, Charlie wondered as he stared from Latin to English and back again. His grandfather was certainly trying to tell him something, but he wasn't sure that he was drawing the connection. Then, seemingly out of the blue, something caught the corner of his eye, and then it practically leaped out at him. "Of course!" Charlie exclaimed to himself, and proceeded to circle the first letter of each line of the Latin text. When he had finished, he saw that they spelled out the word sundial. Almost instinctively, he gazed out the window towards the south wall. It was now quite dark outside, and Charlie imagined that he could see the moonlight reflecting off a gnomon or two. The answer to the next part of the clue had to be something to do with the polyhedral sundial. Two long hours had passed since they had finished dinner and retired to bed, and midnight had just struck on the grandfather clock in the entrance hall. Holding his shoes in one hand, the papers in his pocket, Charlie slipped down the stairs and across the hall. Having successfully navigated the distance to the door without encountering anyone, he cautiously unlocked and opened the massive front door, holding his breath until he had completed the task and left the building. He eased the door shut once more, put on his shoes, and headed for the polyhedral sundial, keeping a wary eye out for any possible interruptions. It was dark, but the moon was casting enough light for him to see where he was going. Once at the sundial, he consulted the riddle again. Then use the locations of Cleopatra's needles and bring together time to reveal what you seek, he muttered to himself. Cleopatra's needles. What did he know about Cleopatra's needles? The only one he knew about stood on the embankment in London. No, wait. He seemed to remember reading that two famous obelisks had been taken from their original home in Egypt. There was one in New York's Central Park as well. He examined the polyhedral sundial closely, and there he found dial faces marked for both cities, London and New York. All right, what was he supposed to do now that he'd found them? Was the sun supposed to shine on the dials, Charlie wondered, and show the same time? That might be all very well during the daytime, but it was late at night now, and moonlight was of little use. Its reflection was too poor to even pique the interest of the styles, much less allow them to throw shadows. But wait, he thought. The time on each dial would never be the same anyway, because the two cities shared different time zones, New York following London by several hours. He stood back from the sundial and contemplated its bizarre shape for some time, thinking. There was the equation of time that Sampson had mentioned earlier, but applying that did not really solve the problem, since it only allowed for a maximum differential of 15 minutes, much less than the time difference between the two cities. There had to be some way to bring together time, but it was certainly eluding him. He was starting to wonder if he should return in the morning, or whether the riddle required daylight to work properly, when a thought occurred to him. Maybe it didn't matter what time it was in the actual cities, but what time it was on the sundial itself. Maybe it didn't matter whether light was even falling on the sundial. Wait a minute, Charlie said to himself. What if all he had to do was physically move the styles themselves to point to the same hour line? It couldn't hurt to try. If he was wrong, he would be no worse off than before. He reached up and tried to twist the styles. The one for London refused to budge, but the New York gnomon twitched enough to encourage him to keep at it. Slowly, he twisted it in the direction of the 12 o'clock line, the time indicated on the London dial. With great difficulty, it began to rotate around a central axis on the dial face itself, until finally, when aligned with the meridian line, there was an audible click deep inside the sundial itself, and a door opened in the columnar base upon which it rested. Bingo, Charlie thought triumphantly, and reached down into the base, where his questing hand found a package. It was an old army rucksack, and it contained something. Back in the attic bedroom, Charlie carefully opened the rucksack to find several objects. He could hardly contain his excitement, as one by one he pulled the objects out of the bag. First out was a battered journal full of his grandfather's handwriting and beautifully drawn sketches, mostly of exotic plants. As Charlie flipped through it, he realized this was the journal and sketchbook that the squire had kept throughout his travels. He put it carefully aside to read later, along with a pocket-sized leather-bound Bible. Next, out of the bag was a small telescope, which was made of brass and exquisitely carved jade, with a penknife to match, although the knife blade was dulled from age. Reaching again into the rucksack, Charlie's fingers brushed up against a large, cold, metallic object. When he withdrew it, he realized that he was holding his grandfather's Webley .38 caliber pistol. Charlie was not comfortable around firearms, particularly handguns. He checked the chamber and discovered it was empty of bullets. With a small sigh of relief, he placed it carefully on the desk. As he pulled a largish, oblong object out of the rucksack, he heard a faint clink and looked down to see that a small, round object on a chain had fallen onto the floor. He picked it up and discovered a gold pendant with a compass on one side and a mirror on the other. He placed it on the dressing table next to his pocket watch with the vague thought that it might prove useful. Charlie then turned his attention to the oblong object, which turned out to be a sealed wax parcel, a protective wax package containing something. Using the rusty penknife, he slid open the package with suddenly excited fingers, desperate to look inside, and found an old notebook. Like the journal and the Bible, it was bound in leather, but this binding was old and buttery soft, worn from much handling. The notebook itself was about the same size as a modern composition book. It seemed to exude an aura of age and mystery and vital importance. The wax packaging must have been used to keep the notebook from getting damp. This was the notebook that his grandfather had intended to come to him. The ancient notebook that contained a vital secret, possibly the location of a great treasure. His mind reeled as he began to grasp the sheer immensity of the mystery that he faced and had been charged to solve. Charlie cautiously opened the notebook, carefully separating the yellowed, fragile pages to keep them from tearing. It was thicker than he had first thought, containing at least 100 pages, if not more. He continued to turn the ancient pages, wondering how many hands had done so before him and what their contributions to its contents might have been. The handwriting on many of the pages appeared to be in the same style, although the languages varied from those that he recognized: Latin, Greek, and French, a spiky Gothic script that he believed was German to those that he did not know, although he guessed that the Greek-like characters on one page might be Cyrillic, Russian, or some similar Eastern tongue. Others he didn't recognize at all and could only speculate as to their origin. But he was amazed at the variety of languages and diagrams contained within the pages. There were also several pages of mathematical formulas, and, he realized with growing excitement, diagrams of sundials. Charlie smiled. This is how grandfather learned to make the polyhedral sundial, he thought to himself. One page in particular stood out from the others. It contained a passage in what looked like Greek, also some hieroglyphs. On the following page there were other symbols similar to the first. As Charlie stared intently, he noticed that a note had been inserted at that page. Carefully, so as not to accidentally tear the surrounding pages, he removed the note and opened it. It was another letter from his grandfather. "Well done, Charlie. I knew that you would find this. Now that you have possession of the notebook, I can tell you a little more of its history. This notebook originally belonged to Nicholas Kratzer, the famous German mathematician and astronomer. He gave it to his friend Thomas More in 1522, whilst they were both in the employment of Henry VIII. Both men tried to figure out the puzzle that it contained, but to no avail. They translated the Greek text on this page, which speaks of a great treasure in Egypt. Unfortunately, they did not keep a copy of the translation, for fear that it would fall into the wrong hands. Your first task is to have the Greek text translated once again. Then there are the strange symbols. I understand that these hieroglyphs, as they are called, can now be read. I think that these are the key to the secret. I didn't have time to have these translated myself, but I believe that they will show you the way to the treasure. You will have to use your brain and keep your wits about you. Many people will want this treasure for themselves, so you must be careful who you tell about this. When you find the treasure, Charlie, I want you to turn it over to the authorities. I know a good man in Egypt called Gaston Maspero. I wrote to him some years ago, so he knows of the notebook, but he doesn't know the full secret. If you get into any trouble in Egypt, contact him. He will help you. He can be trusted. One last thing. This treasure needs to be in a museum. Remember that. There is too much wealth here for one man. My heart is with you on your quest. Solve the mystery for the family and make us all proud. Always tell the truth, and seek the truth, Charlie, and you'll go far in this world. But be careful. Don't trust anyone. Charlie stared from this second piece of correspondence to the notebook and back again, shaking his head slightly. A bead of sweat came to his forehead as he realized that Sir Thomas More, Nicholas Kratzer, and Henry VIII himself had once leafed through these very pages. This undertaking was starting to sound considerably more than a casual lark and bit of riddle solving. At last, Charlie had found himself an adventure. But was this an endeavor that an average young man such as he could pursue properly? Or was he setting himself up to fail? And what of Victoria and his forthcoming engagement? What would she think about him herring off on some wild goose chase? Not to mention his father, who would undoubtedly find a way to put a damper on the whole affair. What on earth would he say? Charlie felt an overwhelming feeling of excitement and apprehension at the same time. Charlie didn't know what to do. The answer seemed to come to him from the portrait of his grandfather hanging over the bed. The eyes in the portrait seemed to be watching him, and he thought that he could almost hear the old man's voice repeating the last paragraph of the second letter. My heart is with you on your quest. Solve the mystery for the family, Charlie, and make us all proud.